A bit of an oddball, interesting choice, unique, all different ways to sum up the cafe-style electric bike. Though for me personally, fun is the only word that comes to mind. So fun, in fact, that Engwe is capable of ignoring at least half of the recommendations I make to every electric bike I've tested up until this point, and still get away with what's quite possibly the most enjoyable electric I've ever ridden. What the M20 lacks in key features and practicality, it makes up for in rideability. And I find myself trying to use this bike for any situation I can get away with, even if it's technically not the best choice for the job. The lines between bicycles, motorcycles, mopeds, and scooters are skewed these days, and the M20 doesn't help much. Yes, it's technically and legally a bicycle, but if you look at this strictly as a bicycle, you'll be disappointed with the lack of features. That's why I kind of have to reformat this video, whereas in most of my bike reviews, I like to get the negatives out of the way first, so nobody has to waste their time if they find any deal breakers. However, it's in my belief that companies releasing these cafe-style frames are not intending them to be looked at as strictly bicycles. More of a low-powered motorcycle with pedals, which would be moped. But like I said, the lines are skewed, and many of the features or lack thereof, which I would complain about on pretty much any other electric bike, just don't really matter much, if at all, on this thing. So for my first impressions in this video, I'm not looking at the M20 as a bicycle, a motorcycle, scooter, or moped. I'm just looking at it for what it is, a two-wheeled vehicle. And do I like it? Well, the short answer is obviously yes, I like the M20. I like it quite a bit, in fact. It has room for improvement, we'll talk about that in the video, but the long answer is yes and no. I like it as a two-wheeled vehicle, but it's a terrible bicycle. Now, if you're in the market for strictly a practical bicycle, don't click off just yet because there's some things about the M20 that might pique your interest. Let me explain. Some of you can probably relate to a similar story, but even if you can't, it's still relevant. When I was younger and living in California, I had a mini bike. It was really fun to ride, but unfortunately, it was illegal to ride it pretty much anywhere. That didn't stop me, however, and I would ride it in any situation I thought I could get away with, occasionally even taking it to school a handful of times. I often found that the only practical purposes of the mini bike were for enjoyment and getting from point A to point B with no cargo other than what you can fit in a backpack. But because it was just so fun to ride, you wanted to use it for anything you could, and that's what I did. Luckily, one of the side effects to going green in pretty much every state is that you can find these cafe-style bikes to be legal in most, if not all, states, so long as their electronic systems comply with the limitations. And that's where the M20 comes in, with a bit more refinement as well. Compared to the rough and rigid frame of my old mini bike, the M20 is a Lamborghini. And even my consideration of making a gas-electric hybrid has been stronger on no other frame than the M20. Even though by today's standards, what you get out of the box on the M20 is nothing really impressive, that doesn't tell the whole story. This bike puts me in a similar situation to when I reviewed the Eagle One scooter from Varla. It's one of those things that until you ride it for the first time, it's impossible to understand how much fun it is. But I hate saying it's one of those things you have to ride to understand, because that gives absolutely no useful information to somebody watching the video. So I'll do my best to explain this bike. After having tested a handful of different throttle configurations on other e-bikes, it's in my opinion that the best configuration is a thumb throttle with cruise control. I personally hate half-twist throttles because everyone I've tested so far has a stiff return spring, which makes your wrist fatigue when you hold it down for extended rides. So normally the lack of cruise control would be a pretty big negative, but luckily they give us a full twist throttle, and for the first time in testing on my channel, a lightweight return spring, so you can easily hold it in any position you want without worrying about your wrist getting tired. This twist throttle does feel on the low end of budget to me. It's pretty gritty when you twist it at a standstill, but luckily you don't tend to notice when riding the bike. I would also normally complain about the bike's lack of customization, especially for pedal assist, but for reasons which are blatantly obvious, this is not really a bike that you pedal unless you're trying to help it get up a steep incline. And don't get me wrong, you actually can pedal this bike easier than I thought you could, but the geometry is so off that you're not really applying much meaningful assistance. And even if you were, the bike's small tires and limited gear ratio only allowed me to apply meaningful assistance up to 15 miles an hour, which is actually the lowest pedal assist level on this bike, so you're maxed out in the gears at its slowest speed. On that note, one change I would like to see them make to this bike, or a customization option I'll do in the future myself, is a shorter crank set. These are long cranks for the size of the bike, and I would often find my feet searching for the pedals after I started moving. It's not a big deal, it's just a little annoying. Don't really need the big cranks on this bike because, well, you're not going to pedal it much. And a shorter crank set would also offer a more comfortable neutral riding position while you're cruising. Not that the bike was ever uncomfortable, I actually find it to be quite comfortable, but these improvements could make it even better. And while we're on the topic of comfort, let's go ahead and take a look at the seat. Initially, I wanted this to be bigger. I thought it was a bit small for what the bike is, even though the footprint of the seat overall is larger than what you would get on pretty much any standard bicycle. All in all, I found it to be decent, and really have no major complaints even under long rides. I would like to see it a bit flatter. It has a slight downwards tilt towards the battery, which I didn't think was really well optimized for the geometry of this bike. Cushioning was decent as well. There could probably be a bit more for extended rides, but I really didn't find any issues. The biggest problem I see in the future is if this seat happens to be uncomfortable for any riders, it's going to be tricky to find another one to put on the bike. I wouldn't even know where to look. Moving underneath the seat to the component of the bike which at times I feel like is doing all the work to increase comfort and therefore enjoyment is the swing arm suspension. Because most of your weight is over the rear tire, this shock has to work overtime. When I first got the bike, I thought it was hydraulic just because of how well it handles rough terrain. But after pushing the bike a bit harder, I can say now with almost certainty that it's a spring-loaded shock. Just budget. That doesn't stop it from doing a pretty good job though. I only really noticed its limitations when pushing the bike under extreme bumpy conditions. I can feel it bottom out on both ends. And this will be one of the first components I replace on the bike. I'll go with a hydraulic shock in the back simply because this does so much for the enjoyment of this bike that I want to give it a bit of a buff. I will sum up the front suspension on this bike is perfectly adequate for what it's intended to do. No point during my testing did I ever feel like I had to be careful because the front suspension might cause issues. I never felt it bottom out. But this is definitely a part you're going to want to look at if you plan on modifying the bike for more power, adding massive rotors to the front for better braking, because they probably won't hold up great in that situation, but for my riding, they did just fine. They're spring-loaded, not hydraulic, they don't have great feel to them, and they have pretty limited travel, less than I expected, but because the rear suspension's doing most of the work, it didn't really seem to matter. The choice for going with the triple trees, I believe, was just for aesthetics. The build quality looks decent, but they look really good on these bikes. As has been the case with pretty much every bike I've tested on the channel, if you give this to someone careless who goes out of their way to beat the crap out of it, things will fail. That's a guarantee. The look, price tag, and feel of this bike might mistake some riders who are not too familiar with electrics into thinking it's capable of handling situations that it isn't. So don't go jumping this thing. I feel that is plenty capable of handling cruising speed under rough riding conditions, but that's about it. The 4-inch wide tires add on to the bike's already cushy ride characteristics, and their small 20-inch diameter combined with the low center of gravity and seating position make this a really fun bike to whip around. And although this bike isn't the most planted or stable that I've ridden on the channel, it certainly feels in control pretty much all the time. It's never tried to bite me, and it's pretty forgiving with its ride characteristics. The M20 has slightly above average braking performance from what you'd expect on other mechanical disc brakes, and I contribute any added performance to the simple fact it has smaller diameter tires. They don't have as much leverage, so they can stop a little bit better. I would have liked to seen hydraulics out the box, you know how it is, but these will certainly be one of the first upgrades I make. Hydraulic brakes with 180mm rotors to replace the 160 on the bike. While we're down here looking at the brakes, I'd like to point out that both wheels use sealed bearings. You love to see it. Dealing with cup and cone bearings, whether you're mechanically inclined or not, is just a headache. It's one less thing to worry about. You don't need to clean and re-grease them if you ride in constant dirty situations. Adjusting them is not an issue because you don't have to. And if they ever do wear out, which is unlikely because they last a lot longer than cup and cones, you just pop them out and punch in some new ones. Finding these things online is super easy with a quick internet search. I can't speak for Engwe, but if their intent was to focus on this more as a low-powered electric motorcycle instead of a bicycle, they certainly paid attention when it came to the lighting system. On my way home from work, we just had a big rain last night. Look at this guy. It's a big old bullfrog just chilling in the road. I'm going to scoop him up and try and get him down these railroad tracks here. Whereas it's not the absolute best I've tested so far, it's pretty close. A single headlight on the M20 is bright enough for this bike's top speed in pitch black situations. Adding 2 of them, even better. They're fully adjustable, they have a daytime running mode, which is pretty bright, and then when you activate them fully, you can see everything. They have a nice wide throw and a top shelf dead zone to make sure you don't blind oncoming traffic. Moving over to the back, their brake light is actually the brightest I've tested on any of my bikes. Its running light is brighter than most of my bike's stop light, and then when you do squeeze the brake levers, it gets even brighter, considerably brighter. At the time of recording, their $1,300 option gets you the single battery version, and $1,600 gets you the dual battery version. I have some recommendations for which one to choose so you don't have to waste money. If you're somebody who absolutely knows they're going to modify this bike, including its power system, then I would only recommend getting the single battery version, as you're most likely going to upgrade the voltage down the road anyways. If you're an individual who plans on doing some light modifications like upgrading the brakes and suspension system and not really touching the power system, then the dual battery version would be the way to go. Now, it may technically be more efficient when it comes to weight savings to have one single larger battery. Having 2 batteries has some conveniences. Because the M20 utilizes a battery equalizer, this allows you to turn on one or both, or one then the other, and it doesn't really matter if the voltages aren't equal between the 2 batteries. It takes care of that for you. For the most part, I just utilize both batteries at the same time. But when I'm going out for a long ride, I love the fact that I can turn on just one battery, ride however I want, and then when it's drained, turn on the other battery and go home. And as long as I haven't significantly decreased my elevation on the way out, I am guaranteed to have enough power to get home. For those of you curious, I did test one battery versus 2 to see if there was any difference in power, and I didn't notice any. Unfortunately, there's no USB charging on the heads-up display where it's most convenient for charging a phone, but both batteries do have a USB port, so it's still there, just not in the best spot. Despite how much fun I've been having riding Engwe's M20, I can unfortunately only recommend it to 2 categories of riders. Number 1 is somebody who plans, or at least intends on making modifications down the road. It's a blank canvas, which is pretty much begging to be modified. Or At the very least, somebody who's going to keep it in their stock configurations but does not live in a hilly environment. And that comes to power. Unfortunately, the M20 is a little anemic. Its out-of-the-box performance just doesn't have a lot of acceleration. Its top speed was fine, and it always had just enough power to get the job done for my riding conditions, but if you live in a hilly environment, you're not going to enjoy the M20. It feels more like a 500 watt motor if I'm honest. It doesn't feel like the other 20-inch diameter electric bikes I've tested on the channel. If they were to use something like a cargo bike power system, which are tuned to have a lot of acceleration, this would have made a great bike even better. And where other electric bikes can easily get away with weaker power systems because they're optimized for pedaling, this unfortunately isn't. You can help the bike in occasional situations, but if you find yourself trying to constantly help it up hills, you're not going to have a good time. The plans I have for this bike: hydraulic brakes, hydraulic rear suspension, and a front motor. I think a dual motor version of this bike would be fantastic, especially since it already has a dual battery option, which makes my life a lot easier when it does come time to modify it. To sum up my first impressions of the M20 as a bicycle, they're really no surprise. Mediocre. It sucks to pedal, it doesn't have enough power to conquer steep hills on its own, its storage space is limited. Unless you can somehow get really creative making your own rear rack, you're not going to have one. And with no customization option, it has the bare minimum of features that you would expect on a decent quality electric bike. However, if we ignore the aspect of a bicycle, to sum up my first impressions of the M20 as a two-wheeled vehicle, it is an absolute blast to ride, and I look forward to modifying it and giving it more power. The bike is a blank canvas that starts at a decent price and allows you to get around laws that used to be really annoying to deal with. If Engwe's intentions were to make a fun two-wheeled vehicle and completely ignore the aspects of a bicycle, then they did a good job. And it's really not a complaint in my opinion, because not many people looking at these styles of bikes care about the bicycle aspect of the ride. And if you are one of those individuals, I hope you got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least were mildly entertained. Until next time, ride safe.